All right, we are now live for Stoic Sunday number 2. And we started out last week or not last week, last month, talking about the 4 virtues. So today we're going to do a deeper dive into one of the virtues in particular, and that is the virtue of wisdom or practical wisdom or prudence, however you want to call it. What I'm going to do, I've got some remarks prepared, and I'll talk for a while. You can put stuff into the chat if you want to, but I probably won't get to the chat until we get to the discussion and Q&A portion of this. And we're going to do deep dives like this on each of the 4 cardinal Stoic virtues: wisdom, justice, courage, temperance. And as it turns out, the Stoics actually have a lot more to say about these things other than, they're good and you should have them. So let's jump right into talking about this. The virtue of wisdom has a really, really central role. You could say even more central than the other 3 virtues in Stoicism. And a number of Stoic authors will talk about this and reference it. And it's partly because the term and idea of wisdom is actually covering 2 different things that overlap and intersect, which we'll talk about in a moment. But these are the sort of things that I think people who hear this and they're like, yeah, wisdom, that sounds good. I mean, philosophy is supposed to be about wisdom. They usually got questions about. So we're going to delve into these. One is the relationship between wisdom and philosophy as such, which the Stoics do talk about. Wisdom in its relationship to the other virtues. The sage, the wise person, right, is an ideal for Stoicism as well as for other philosophies of life in the ancient period. So we've got to clarify what the relationship between the virtue of wisdom and the wise person is a little bit. And then we got to talk about wisdom and practical wisdom as one of these virtues. What does it consist in? What does it cover? What does it include? And so we're going to look at quite a few different passages. And before we do that, I want to start out with just a few these might be helpful for you, sort of charting the way types of things. So in Greek, there are 2 main terms that get translated as wisdom or as prudence or practical wisdom. Sophia is one of them, right? Which has been turned into a person's name, meaning, the wise one. And phronesis. And phronesis comes from, this entire vocabulary of like thinking words. And these are often used interchangeably. So if you're reading Platonic dialogues, for example, Socrates will sometimes use one word, sometimes use another word. They're not different from each other in Plato, really. Aristotle will distinguish the 2 of these, but Aristotle is dividing up philosophy and he's got a different anthropology. So he's dividing up philosophy differently, and he's got a different, understanding of the human soul than the Stoics do. So we don't want to follow Aristotle here. The Stoics are not Aristotelian in that respect. In Latin, there's really 3 terms that get used. Sapientia is corresponding to the Latin or to the Greek Sophia, and sometimes they'll just use Sophia in there. But then there's also this prudentia, which is sort of a rendering of phronesis. So we got a lot of vocabulary floating around. Are the Stoics entirely consistent in their use of these? No. And we don't have to be super, super concerned about that, but it is good to know that there are these different terms out there. In English, how do we translate these? Well, wisdom is a popular way. Sometimes we say practical wisdom when we're referencing prudentia or phronesis. We also use the word prudence. One text even uses intelligence, which I don't think is a particularly good translation of prudentia or phronesis, but you're stuck with the translations that you got. So as usual, if we want to understand what the Stoics really think about this, you've got a couple options, right? You can go to modern popularizers or academic interpreters of the Stoics, which would include me, and you can, take what they have to say. Or you can, do what you really ought to do, the smart thing to do, the wise thing to do, and that is to go back to classic Stoic texts. Because if modern day interpreters are any good, they're constantly going back to the original sources and seeing what these people had to say. And you don't know who's actually really that reliable until you check them against the classic sources. So what classic sources, what classic texts are we talking about here? We got the big three late Roman thinkers: Seneca, Epictetus. They're really helpful on this. Marcus Aurelius, I think, is good to look at as well. And then we also have Musonius Rufus, who I'm going to talk about a little bit. We've got Heracles the Stoic. So we've got these late Roman Stoics, and that's great. But there's also two really important summaries of Stoic doctrine, which are not written by Stoics. And I mentioned these in the last session. Diogenes Laertes' Lives of the Philosophers, Book 7, is devoted entirely to the Stoics. And in the very first chapter of that, The Life of Zeno, he's got a great digression where he's like, since I'm talking about Zeno, I'm talking about these Stoics, let me tell you what it is that these people believe, and he summarizes what he takes to be the Stoic doctrine. Same thing is happening in Arius Didymus, sometimes mistakenly called Stobaeus, because Arius Didymus's works are found in Johannes Stobaeus's much larger collection. But Arius Didymus's epitome of Stoic ethics also tells us about these virtues as well. And then we've got this guy who I'm a huge fan of, and I hope that some of you become fans of as well, Marcus Tullius Cicero, right? Who is not a Stoic himself, but who is very, very interested in and influenced by Stoicism. He even says at one point, if I was not an academic, I would be a Stoic. And some of his works are really, really helpful and fill in a lot of missing information that we otherwise wouldn't have. So that's some background stuff. The next thing that I'm going to talk about, the big sort of topic: why do we need wisdom? Where does it come from? Is it something that's like an add-on to us, or is it something that's essential for human beings? And the Stoics think that wisdom itself develops out of our distinctively human nature, the kind of animals, rational animals that we are. Even before we are particularly rational, we're being driven towards wisdom and the things that wisdom engages with. So Cicero, in his book On the Ends, where he's having Cato, the great Stoic philosopher, statesman, and military leader, talking, Cato says that all beings that are sentient have self-consciousness or affection. If you've heard of oikeiosis, this is that idea. It's just not being called that. And it includes cognitions, cognitio, right? Comprehensions, in Latin, comprehensio, perceptions, catalepsis. All of these things are different ways of talking about what it is that our brains, what it is that our minds are doing. And he goes on to say that these embrace and contain the truth, and that we've got a sort of innate drive to discover things. And he talks about two different levels in which this takes place. Now, children, by their very nature, are pretty curious monsters, aren't they? If anybody's ever babysat or let alone had a toddler, your job is basically to keep them from killing or maiming themselves. And why is it? Because they get into everything, right? Because they're curious. They want to know about things. They enjoy learning. And, until maybe somebody screws things up for them in terms of their education or moral development. But children naturally do enjoy learning things. Now, Do other animals also enjoy that? Yes, and we can talk about that in a bit. But when we get to the second level of what Cicero is calling the sciences, scientiae, that is sort of disciplinary bodies of knowledge about things, that's something distinctive to human beings. You know, the fact that you and I are talking right now about Stoicism and philosophy, that's not something that elephants or crows or octopi or other, highly intelligent species are doing. And it's not something that all human beings are necessarily doing, but all human beings have the potential for doing that sort of thing. And they are by nature interested in learning those sorts of things. He points out another thing as well in that passage. We find mental assent to the false repugnant. Nobody likes being lied to. When they realize, and it may take a while for them to realize that they're being lied to, they're usually upset about it, right? In On Duties, Cicero says the search, inquisitio, after truth and its eager pursuit, investigatio in Latin, are peculiar to human beings. And he says something else really interesting here. We come to understand that what is true and simple and genuine appeals most strongly to a human being's nature. So we've got this kind of natural drive towards it. In On the Ends, Cato again talking, he says that we're first commended to wisdom by the primary natural instincts from the initial beginnings in nature. And then afterwards, wisdom itself becomes dearer, more valuable to us than are the instincts from which we came to her. A little bit later in that passage, he's talking about living different kinds of lives. And he says, just as our bodies aren't designed for just doing any kind of activity, our faculty of appetition or choice, in Greek horme, was not designed for just any old kind of life, but for a particular mode of living. And the same is true of reason and perfected reason. Ratio et perfecta ratio. Interesting turn of phrase there for Cicero to use, right? Not just our faculty of rationality, but our faculty of rationality when it's being developed, which is, how we could translate perfected. Epictetus says, why did we get reason from nature? Well, it's to properly use impressions or appearances, whatever we want to translate fantasiae as. And then he says, well, what is reason itself? And he says, well, it's a kind of system, systema of fantasiae. So it's naturally self-contemplative, meaning it looks at itself. Theorein is the Greek word for, investigating or looking at. And then he says, what are the things that wisdom, phronesis, has been given to contemplate? Things good or bad, things neither good or bad. And so he says, you see that wisdom comes to contemplate itself and its opposite. So part of what we're doing as we're thinking about things is thinking about thinking and thinking about how we go wrong in thinking. And this is leading us gradually to this virtue. Seneca in On Leisure, he reminds us that the greatest good is living in accordance with nature. And what does this mean? We are created for contemplation and action. So the contemplation part is important. And he says, as human beings, we desire knowledge of the unknown. That's why we're so interested in travelers and their reports about what was it like over there in Egypt? What was it like hanging out with the Phoenicians, right? We're interested in spectacles. We're interested in digging into each other's secrets or digging into the secrets of nature. And he says, nature itself has granted us human beings an inquisitive disposition. And he calls us spectators of the greatest spectacle, if we want to be. He says, nature did not just want to be seen, but to be closely observed. So we, as a part of nature, are in a kind of privileged position. I mean, Seneca goes on to talk about how, nature made us stand erect so we can see farther. Maybe there's something to that, maybe not, but we have capacities that allow us to engage with the world and to engage with ourselves and to engage with that very engagement in a thoughtful, rational way. So this is the roots of our capacity for wisdom. So what's wisdom for? What are the functions or what is its scope? again, Seneca in On the Happy Life says, happy is the life that's in accordance with its own nature, and there's no other way for this to come about than if first the intellect is healthy and in unending possession of its own health. This is where the virtue of wisdom is going to play an important role. In On Duties, Cicero tells us that wisdom is concerned with the full perception and intelligent development of the true. The truth is like the material that, and he uses the word materia in Latin, that this virtue deals with. When we look at Arius Didymus, he tells us that the main functions of wisdom or intelligence, phronesis, is to do a couple things. The first is to view and do what must be done. In Greek, it's theorein, right? So contemplating. Kai prachein. Prachein is a word for doing, activity. Ho poieton, what needs to be done. And then to do so in a way where we make prioritizations. Proegumenos. And then he says, secondarily, to view what we need to apportion, to divide up, what we need to choose, what we need to endure in order that we can do what needs to be done unerringly, so that we do it the way that we're supposed to. We do it when we're supposed to, and we do it constantly. In Seneca's letter 90, which I very, very highly recommend to you, Seneca tells us that wisdom does a number of different things. And he also says that wisdom doesn't educate the hand, it educates the mind. This is why he'll tell us that Posidonius, the great, middle Stoic philosopher, he's wrong in thinking that technologies and, arts and stuff like that were discovered by the wise. Seneca says wisdom isn't really concerned with that. It does other things. What does it do? He tells us a whole bunch of things that wisdom does. It keeps the other crafts under its authority. Some of you may, have like seen those memes and stuff where it says like, knowledge and wisdom, here's how they differ from each other. Wisdom, will basically tell you how to use a certain kind of knowledge. So for example, is a tomato a fruit, right? Yes, a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom will tell you not only, whether you should put it in the food or not, but also, whether you should argue with other people about whether tomatoes are fruits and when you ought to do that. So keeping the other crafts under its authority. Wisdom is sort of an architectonic, that is master craftsman craft, right? And wisdom is able to look at itself. He also tells us that it has happiness as its goal, and it leads the way for us and opens the doors for us. It also teaches us what is good and what is bad. Without that, we're kind of screwed, aren't we? If we don't have a really not just clear conception, because we could have an illusorily clear conception, but an accurate conception of what's actually good and bad and what's in the middle and how good and how bad are things, right? He says it also purges our minds of illusions. It has a role in taking away things that we think to be knowledge, which actually aren't knowledge, which are misinformation. He tells us it gives us a conception of nature as a whole and also of itself. That is, wisdom tells us what wisdom is, because wisdom is connected to itself in this way. He says it reveals the identity and attributes of the gods. That might be something that, we put aside and we're not quite so worried about, but it was definitely important for the early Stoics. Takes us to the world's origin, the everlasting rationality infused through the whole, the power of all generative principles, the seminanes rationales, the rational principles of everything that is. It investigates the mind in a variety of different ways, and wisdom scrutinizes the truth and its criteria and helps us sort out ambiguities. So that is quite a lot of different things, different functions that the virtue of wisdom, if we're cultivating it, ought to be doing for us. Now, it gets yet more complex because the Stoics, for each of the cardinal virtues, they broke those cardinal virtues down into sub-virtues, right? Secondary, you could call them virtues. They use the term of, a capital, a head. We call them primary or, cardinal virtues, and then there'd be these others underneath it. Diogenes Laertes tells us that wisdom is really concerned with rational choice. He says that the kalon, the beautiful or the good in itself, has four types, and he talks about the four virtues. And the way that he characterizes wisdom is epistemonikon, as knowing, as having knowledge of things, but also involving what we ought to choose. And so he says if a person has virtue, they can figure out and do, and again, he uses the words, theoretike and praktike, what ought to be done. And these things that ought to be done include what should be chosen and a bunch of other things. And so when we can figure that out, we can act with intelligent choice. We can prioritize correctly. We can make good decisions. And so wisdom for him, Diogenes Laertes, according to the Stoics, has basically two main component parts. Good counsel, it's how it's translated as in the Loeb edition, euboulia in Greek, and understanding or synesis. When we get to Arius Didymus, however, we find that wisdom includes 6 different sub-virtues. One of them has already been mentioned, euboulia, which gets translated there as soundness of judgment. Good counsel, soundness of judgment, basically the same thing. That is defined there as knowledge of what sorts of things and how to do them, right? What sort of things we ought to do, how we ought to do them, so that we can act. Now it's translated as expediently, but we could say profitably or usefully, or in terms of getting to the things that we want. Sum pherontos is the Greek for that. Then he doesn't talk about understanding or synesis. He talks about 5 other ones. Circumspection, eulogistia, knowledge that marks off, that distinguishes and summarizes, sun kephalaotike in Greek, right? Placing under headings, right, is how summarizing is understood here. What is still developing or in process, what is happening, to gignomenon, and what is completed, what has been brought to its fulfillment. Then there's a third one, shrewdness, anchinoia, sort of like having a mind. Noia is coming from nous, meaning mind, and anchi has this sort of like closing in, but not a narrow mind, rather a mind that's able to focus on what it's supposed to do. And this is knowledge, as it's defined by the Stoics, of that's able to discover the appropriate act or duty. So this is very important for the Stoics, right? They have this notion of duties, of what you ought to be doing. Like, you're a son, you have a father, you're supposed to have certain duties in relation to him, right? You have a kid, you're supposed to have certain duties in relation to them. How do you figure this stuff out when it gets to tricky situations? Like, for example, when Musonius Rufus talks about, your parent tells you to do something that's actually bad for them, like give them, food or drink that they're not supposed to have. You're supposed to obey your parents. That's a duty. What do you do in that circumstance? And it's wisdom that helps you figure out, well, giving them the thing they want wouldn't actually be good for them. So you're not really obeying them in that sort of circumstance. That is shrewdness, or anchinoia. And it works in conditions or situations, ectu parachrema, the things that you're surrounded by, right? So that's the third one. What's the fourth one? Sensibleness. This literally means having a mind. Nun echeia, right? Nous meaning mind. Echein means, having something. So holding on to it. Knowledge of what is worse and what is better. Now, this is important, right? So we know that wisdom includes knowledge of what is good, what is bad, what is indifferent. That's nice. But we also, and this is where things get much more difficult for us in life, right? we need to know what's better. Of two goods, if we have to choose between one of them, which is the one that should be preferred? If two things are bad, right? Which of them is the worst thing? This is something very important to develop. And some people, I think, do have a conception of what is good or bad, but they don't do particularly well when it comes to figuring out what is uh, better and worse, right? And that they get tripped up with that. Then we have this thing called soundness of aim, eustochia, knowledge that is able to hit the target. That's the way it's being framed in each case, right? So being able to center in on the things that are relevant or important. And then finally, ingenuity. This is a very interesting term. Mechania, right? This is the word that we get mechanical from, meche, right? Knowledge that is able to discover the way out or through, dxodu, right? Hodos is road, and we get the word method from it. In this case, we're able to find the way out of matters, pragmaton. It's translated as difficulties. Able to figure out what, the way through the situation is. This is what Arius Didymus says wisdom encompasses as these 6 sub virtues. So we've got a lot of stuff going on here, right? We've talked about the scope of wisdom, the things that it extends to, the fact that it's self-contemplative. There's a couple other things that I wanted to bring up that don't fit neatly into these categories. For example, Musonius Rufus. I think this kind of illustrates the application of some of these aspects or sub-virtues of wisdom. He tells us in his first lecture, he's talking about, do you need to prove everything all the time? And he says, it is mistaken zeal for the teacher, if he be a true philosopher, to rehearse a multitude of arguments and proofs to his pupils. He should instead touch on each one with just measure, seek to penetrate to the very intellect of his hearer, and present persuasive arguments as such cannot be easily refuted. But most of all, so notice there, you got to figure out what kind of learner are you dealing with, and don't overwhelm them with a lot of stuff. Give them what it is that they actually need in the situation. We could apply this to not just teaching and learning, but giving counsel to people, ruling, all sorts of things like that. And then he says, his treatment should consist in showing himself not only as one who utters words which are most helpful, but as one who acts consistently with them. So that's important too. Wisdom is not just a purely intellectual thing. It is something that you display in the way that you actually live, in how you treat people, how you handle situations yourself. Are you wise if you can set up a beautiful class site that students can explore, but when they ask you about things in emails, you don't have responses? Maybe not, right? So this is an important aspect too. I'll just bring up one other passage, and then we'll start going to some of these questions and comments. Epictetus tells us that it's really important to have good judgments, dogmata in Greek, right? Or opinions is another way you can translate these. Why? Because these determine so much else. The things that we think, those, generally enter into the hopper of our mind and wind up through our reasoning processes and our volitions, determining what it is that we think and we do. So having the mind, the dianoia, in accordance with nature is important. And this involves having reason, logos, judgments, dogmata, assents, synkatetheses, choices, hormas, desires, orexis, in accordance with nature. And that's the ideal for Epictetus. It's not just a matter of having your proiresis or faculty of choice in accordance with nature. You should have all these aspects in accordance with nature. And let's remember, too, that in accordance with nature for Stoics does not just mean like what science reveals to us or the natural universe. It means our distinctively human nature as properly developed, as fully developed as we can be. And then he says, well, if you've got that, then you can take up logical study, logos, as a kind of, and it's translated in the Loeb edition as hobby. Philotechnon, right, is interesting. But what that really means is as something that we enjoy, something that we love, something that we desire to have, the techne developed in. And so, this gives you at least a sense of what wisdom encompasses. It's not just something summarized in knowing what's good or bad, right? Or being smart or anything like that. For the Stoics, it covered a whole bunch of ground, and it had to be developed in all these different parts and portions. And so that gives us an idea about what we ought to be doing as we develop as human beings. And the last thing that I'll say is we want to be careful when we're reading the Stoics talking about the sage, the sophos, the wise person, right? They come along very rarely. They, say all sorts of really interesting things about the sage, but we're all sort of on our way rather than being sages, as Seneca points out to us, right? We are procoptoi or proficientes, depending on whether you like your Greek or Latin. And that means that we can be developing this virtue of wisdom without necessarily having totally worked it out, being at the highest level, being sages. We can become more and more wise, right? So this is something important. I will point out that sometimes the Stoics talk as if virtues are like an on-off switch. I think that's a very unhelpful and confusing way to talk about the virtues, and to some degree, so does Seneca as well when you look in his works. All right, let's take. So a lot of people saying hello. People are different places. It's noon here for Dan and Albert. It's an evening. Mark says theoria apparently is derived from to spectate, and I think that's a great way to describe that experience they're talking about. It's like letting things disclose themselves. Yeah, I mean, by the time that we get to the Stoics, theoria means a lot of different things. So when we're looking at ancient philosophy terms, we can go all Heidegger and be like, well, the origin of this is this. And that's nice to know because sometimes that reveals things to us. But all the other things that it gains along the way, I think, is important as well. So just thinking about is also theoria, right? We don't necessarily have to be like at a spectacle looking at that. It can be, I mean, the self-contemplative capacity of our mind and of the faculty of reason and of the virtue of wisdom for the Stoics is a prime example of that. That's a different sense than like to spectate, to look at something that's going on. Although it could be connected, like you're realizing that your emotions are out of whack or your reasoning processes are wrong because somebody pointed it out to you, and after you finish being ticked off with them for correcting you, you're like, oh yeah, that's what's happening. So and the theoria and prachen, the thinking or seeing or paying attention to, and then the doing, these are intimately connected with each other for the Stoics. Mark also says it's nice to see such a rich vocabulary trying to capture this concept. Not everything is just about Sophia. Makes me wonder about the nuances among meanings of terms we use in English. Yeah. I kind of think that, and I mentioned this a little bit at the start, and I'll sort of spell this out a little bit more now, that the sophos, the sage, the Sophia that they have, we might call capital S Sophia, right? And the virtue of Sophia or phronesis, of wisdom, that the Stoics are saying is one of the four that we need, which, by the way, virtue is, one thing. It's broken down into four pieces, which then have their own breakdown into other pieces. I would say that that's, something the sage absolutely has, but it's something that we can cultivate without ourselves trying to be sages. And I think that's very important because so many people get themselves discouraged by reading about the sage and by setting these impossible to reach um, ideals for themselves in an unwise way, I think. So ironically, rational, wise understanding of wisdom is probably going to be much more directed to what can I actually make of myself now? How can I become a little bit more intelligent? How can I quit making such dumb decisions, as I've been making? How can I improve to some degree? It's not about trying to get to absolute perfection, sagehood. It's about like, how can I make myself a little bit less screwed up? How can I get back to something that's closer to what a fully developed human nature would look like? So those are good points and good questions. Any other questions about the topic or the things that we've covered by anybody? Now is the time to weigh in, and I'll try as best as I can to answer or address them. In the meantime, I'll point out that we are going to do similar deep dives in the weeks and month to come. So one more this month and then two next month on the other three cardinal virtues of justice and courage and temperance, because the Stoics do in fact have a lot to say about each of these. And it's very important to get beyond just mere generalities or abstractions and to talk about what did they actually have to say about what justice looks like, or what temperance actually consists in. And we're going to be going back to the same authors and the same sources, those summaries of Stoic ethics with Arius Didymus and Musonius Rufus, and not Musonius Rufus, Diogenes Laertes. We'll be looking at Rufus, Epictetus, Seneca. We'll talk about what Cicero has to say. All right, Rick, is wisdom over other virtues, or do they have equal value? Yes, both. Wisdom is you could say, the first among equals, right? If we want to use that phrase. In a certain respect, if we want to think about it with capital S, Sophia, or capital W, wisdom, all the virtues involve wisdom in some way. And wisdom, this is interesting too. Wisdom, just like the other virtues, has its origin in our natural inclinations, desires, and stuff like that. But it goes beyond it and elevates us in ways beyond even what the other three do. You need wisdom in order for courage to be courage, for example, right? Jeremiah says two types of Stoics, Platonic and Aristotelian. No, that's completely wrong. Stoics are a different school. I mean, the easiest way to look at that is look at the anthropology, right? Plato has a tripartite anthropology. Aristotle has a bipartite anthropology. Stoics don't. They have a different anthropology. So you always want to look at the Stoics on their own terms, just as much as with any other school. The idea that everybody's either an Aristotelian or a Platonist got into the history of philosophy through a lot of bad takes. Jeremiah, any thoughts on Seneca's argument for suicide? He doesn't have an argument for suicide. He has clarifications about when suicide would be appropriate for a person. He's not saying everybody should kill themselves, because that's what an argument for suicide would be. Seneca thinks that, and this is a consistent Stoic idea, that if things are such that life becomes unendurable, and you are pretty well off in terms of developing the virtues, not a problem. The foolish person committing suicide because they lost their job, or they're in a love affair and it goes badly, they shouldn't commit suicide. But they will commit suicide in some cases, and that's precisely how screwed up their thinking is. I mean, Epictetus has this great passage where he's talking about poverty, and he says, what is it you're really worried about being poor? What is it you're worried about? You know, is it you're worried that you're not going to get to eat anything, or is it you're not going to eat the stuff that you like now? And people will kill themselves over all sorts of things, to avoid disgrace, to not have their dirty business dealings revealed, or things like that, right? Um, so there isn't a one size fits all thing about suicide for the Stoics. Obviously Cato committed suicide. Why? Because it was serving a greater good. He was not going to allow himself to be used for propaganda purposes by a tyrant, that is Julius Caesar, who he'd fought against as best he could. Seneca commits suicide at the order of Nero. Why does Seneca commit suicide? Well, because if he hadn't, Nero probably would have killed everybody near and dear to Seneca, you know. So, we want to be thoughtful as we approach this. The answer, I guess, would be you have to look at the situation and the goods and evils that are involved, right? Not just for you, but for other people. And then you have to, prudentially make a decision. All right, coffee smug. For Stoics, are virtues intrinsically good because those are things that we desire as ends in themselves? No. Or is there some other reason what makes virtuous life something we should aspire to? Virtues are intrinsically good. They're not intrinsically good because we desire them. We desire them because they're intrinsically good, right? Even the people who are messed up and are, pretty badly off and vicious still would like to think of themselves, the coward would like to think of himself as courageous, right? And can even see something valuable there. The virtues are modes of human goodness, they're what it looks like when a human being has developed their nature properly. And to go to Ephron's question, as a Muslim, my virtue is relative to God. God wants you. I mean, if you have any good interpretation of Islam or Christianity that isn't a pure voluntarism, God wants you to be virtuous. And God wants you to be virtuous, not just because God wants you to be virtuous as sort of a capricious tyrant. God wants you to be virtuous because that's good for you and good for other people, because virtues are good. I mean, you can read many other authors on this. Think about St. Augustine, who says virtue is not the good, but it's certainly like the way that God wants us to be. We live in a world where the virtues are still combating against vices, and many of the virtues of the pagans were splendid vices. Yeah, that's all true, but they're still good, right? So some of these are sort of like putting the cart before the horse kind of mistakes. Virtue is what makes us live a happy life. I mean, and you can provide like very abstract philosophical arguments for this, or you can say, do you like not being screwed up? Do you like being less screwed up in your life? Well, maybe you follow these paths and try to cultivate these things, and you'll get to see experientially what it's like to be less screwed up. Right? So, I mean, I think a lot of people overthink this matter of like, why should I be virtuous? And the Stoics would be perfectly fine with saying to you after they give their arguments, hey, you don't want to be virtuous. You want to be, unjust. You want to be cowardly. You want to be intemperate. You want to be foolish. Go try that out for a while. See how that works out for you. And the people around you who will say, man, why can't you get your shit together? Right. And that's, sounds like there's a fire on the way. That's what happens. Arnie says, why is it so easy to fall into vice while virtue is difficult to begin on the path? I wouldn't say it is. I would say that, it's up to you. And, you can choose. I mean, there's a lot of vices where you got to kind of work at them to work your way into them if you've got a decent enough moral starting point. I mean, like all these people say, nobody really wants to buy into falsehood, right? So, I mean, if you really, really find it difficult to be temperate, you're probably already in vice, right? Rather than being like in a middle position. And, vices promise short-term gains. And if you're motivated by those, then you're going to have to resist that. wisdom is part of that. Like wisdom, think about developing wisdom. Part of that is so basic and simple, like saying, do I want to make the decision this way? Do I want to go eat that third cake, or do I want to do something else instead? Mark says part of virtues are that they are doing good things in good ways. It's acting such as to do the best of things. The question should be, why would I want to act poorly? Why would I want to suck? Yeah, I mean that's sort of a good way to put it in a very basic, gets us right where we are kind of way, right? And there are temptations, but we're also human beings that can choose for ourselves. I mean, part of what's really hard for a lot of people, this is a little bit of a digression, but we'll come back to this, is that they've got the wrong, like Epictetus says, dogmata, right? They've been told things like you need to, get the most out of life at every moment. So, if it's the third slice of cake, you better think short term and have that piece of cake right now, right? Why should you put off, having it to tomorrow? Indulge yourself today. Well, those are dogmata, right? And we didn't, part of what we can do is we can think about, geez, where did I get these wrong-headed ideas about things? Think about anger too, right? You get angry with people and you're like, I got to punch that guy out. And well, where the hell did that idea come from? I don't know. Maybe it came from your jackass dad and uncles, or the kids at school, or the stuff that you're consuming, through media, or and what we have to do. And the Stoics really don't talk, the classic Stoics don't talk about this that much. And actually, neither do the present day interpreters. This is where we actually do need to think about where our dogmata, where our ideas are coming from. Maybe do something like psychotherapy, right? That could be a helpful adjunct. Coffee smug. I get the idea. I get the sense from Epictetus, you should fulfill your duty because that's the best thing you could do in life, or subjectively most satisfying. That seems related to what people desire most. Most people don't really desire to do their duties. That's why they're like, oh crap, I've been invited to, this thing, or oh, I got to go over to mom and dad's place, and hang out with them for a while, or oh, I got to help a friend move, right? Most people aren't naturally inclined to doing their duties. There's a wide spectrum, right? So, and Epictetus thinks that, you should fulfill your duties for a variety of reasons, because it's the right thing to do, right? That's a reason, because it will, on some level, make you happy. That is, being in a good, place where you can say, I did what I needed to do. Two different reasons there. We don't always have to try to reduce these things down to one single reasoning, especially when the texts don't bear that out. Absurdo. How can virtue and Stoicism help women fight against their erasure from history? There is no erasure from history going on. So I'm going to leave that one right there. That's just silliness. That's imprudence. That's the opposite of wisdom right there. If you've got those sort of thoughts, you want to start looking at them really carefully, and why you're buying into them, and why you would even repeat them in, as your opportunity to engage with a, thoughtful conversation. That's exactly the sort of stuff that Stoics would say, look, that's foolishness, and you want to dig that out and replace it with wisdom. Ephron, what are the Stoics' view on sex? Were they against sex for pleasure outside of having kids or any kind of hedonism? Didn't they see sex or sexual desire as distraction from gaining higher truth? No, that's all off base right there. So Musonius Rufus actually has, discussions of marriage and whether marriage keeps us from being able to be philosophers or not. And, part of it is producing new little human beings, but, sex and intimacy is also supposed to produce friendship. And the Stoics have talked about this quite a bit. You can actually, I've written about this, and my wife and I do workshops and talks about this, erotic desire, romance, partnered relationships, Stoicism, perfectly compatible with that. Being a Stoic and participating heavily in the hookup culture, those are probably contradictory to each other, right? But most of the people participating in the hookup culture are not doing so just because they're desiring pleasure. It's because they're lonely, lonely people and don't know who they are and think that their value is measured primarily by how many conquests they have or stuff like that. And we could go on and on. There's like a whole conversation to be had about this. Pleasure is a preferred indifferent for the Stoics, right? It is not something bad. It is not something intrinsically good. There's nothing wrong with enjoying sexual pleasure, provided it's not screwing you up in other ways. And by the way, even the Epicureans say, this can often get us into trouble. Now, are the Stoics against any kind of hedonism? Depends on what you mean by hedonism. If you mean the idea that life is about enjoying pleasure as much as possible and avoiding pain as much as possible, yeah, the Stoics are against that, right? So are the Aristotelians, so are the Platonists. Even the Epicureans are against other kinds of hedonism, like the Cyrenaic, let's just party all night kind of hedonism. If you're talking about a proper recognition that pleasure plays a role within a human life and that giving other people pleasure can be a good thing to do, might be actually be part of our duties or appropriate acts, well, then pleasure can actually function there. It's very important to remember that for the Stoics, these virtues, wisdom, justice, temperance, courage, they're not just about like the perfect pure life way over here. They're about all these indifferents and how we use them, our bodies, our emotions, our pleasures and pains, those, our wealth, our reputation. Those are not things that we say, oh, we just don't give a shit about them at all. We use them prudently, right? Mark says, what would be the opposing vice to wisdom? Folly, foolishness. It's got different names. Do they see ignorance as a vice? They see ignorance as sort of a part of a vice, you could say, right? There's a lot of ways to be foolish. You can be foolish by being ignorant, and you can be ignorant by having the wrong ideas about things when you should have better ideas. You can be ignorant by not knowing something that you should know. We can talk about whether one is culpable for one's ignorance or, whether one is just, kind of stuck, unfortunately, in a condition where they're ignorant. For example, right now in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it turns out that a lot of those poor bastard Russian soldiers who were digging around Chernobyl had no idea that a massive nuclear catastrophe took place there because they hadn't been taught about it in their educational system. And so, when people were like, don't dig there, what are you doing? Where's your I don't remember. We call them MOP suits in the Army, for nuclear, biological, chemical stuff. But they didn't know that they should have any of that sort of stuff. That's one kind of ignorance. The kind of ignorance that consists in like, going on Facebook or Twitter and, participating in particular communities where you're routinely being fed misinformation to make you panicky and, and then you're reinforcing it. That's a very different kind of ignorance, right? And so, foolishness would be like the overarching vice, but it could take all sorts of forms. Stubbornness, sticking to things when it's not the right thing to do. Epictetus talks about this. A lot of people assume that Stoicism means you make a decision and you stick with it. And Epictetus says, it's got to be the right decision because otherwise you're sticking with a bad decision, aren't you? He's got this example of a guy who decides that he's going to end his life. He's just not going to eat anymore and he'll starve himself to death. And Epictetus says, what's your motivation for this? Because if your motivation is a good motivation, okay, that's fine. If your motivation is just like, I'm gonna show those bastards, well, that's stupid. And it wouldn't be good to follow through on that resolution. As a matter of fact, you should prudently, thoughtfully, wisely reconsider it. As a matter of fact, a lot of behaving prudently for us screwed up poor schmucks that are not the sage is going to consist a lot of the time in saying, oh man, I was wrong. How do I fix this? How do I get myself back on track? Right. That is indeed part of prudence. Sometimes prudence consists in saying, wow, I am not as smart as I thought I was. I better find a way to figure out how to be smarter going forward and how to fix the things that I screwed up because of my dumbness in the past. So any other questions, comments, issues about wisdom, sub-virtues, natural human desire to learn things, know things, understand things, or other Stoic related matters? Well, I'm waiting for people to write. I'll remind you that we're going to be doing another thing. So Efron says, is Japanese philosophy similar to Stoicism? That you can't really say that, because is there a Japanese philosophy? No, there's a whole bunch of different Japanese philosophers. So, I mean, I suppose insofar as its philosophy, it's similar to Stoicism, but that's about as far as you can go. AC, would Stoicism always be the method to resolve life issues? That's a good question. So I am not myself somebody who would describe myself as just a Stoic, right? I use Stoicism for different things, sort of like Cicero. I'm an eclectic. I take big parts of systems and then I bring them together in ways that work. So, I mean, there are some people who try to use Stoicism as the single method to resolve life issues. And then they often get themselves into trouble, often because they don't fully understand. They're not reading, like the Stoic texts the way they ought to be. They're reading some popular literature on it. And then they get into situations and, it's not covered well. And then they get all pissed off. And then they go into like a Stoicism Facebook group and complain about that. I think Stoicism, like many other things, can be successfully brought in, but you have to prudently consider which ideas you want to keep and consider. Barles, is there a place for regret in Stoic philosophy? Yeah, there certainly is. It's viewed as a negative emotion that you don't want to have. But if you do have it, then you probably want to figure out why you're feeling it and start looking at your dogmata and the decisions that you made. And, you try to wean yourself away from it, right? Mark Smith, what's the next virtue deep dive? Good question. I want to say that it's justice, but I don't remember quite if that's, it is justice. And then we're going to do temperance and courage the following month. Coffee Smug, do you think Epictetus is a moral intuitionist, or is goodness reducible to some natural property? No and no. I think those sort of isms and abstract classifications are kind of off base and not particularly useful for understanding robust virtue ethics. All right, AC says that one again strikes the point of critical thinking. I'm not sure what that means. Massac says, how did Stoicism influence cognitive science? It didn't influence cognitive science. It primarily influenced the cognitive approaches in psychotherapy, which are not the same thing as cognitive science. It's a case where you don't want to be misled by them using the same word. Cyrillic writing, I can't really read it, but do you recommend Seneca to those who liked Epictetus's works? Yeah, I recommend all the Stoics. I mean, if you want to know about Stoicism, there is absolutely no substitute for spending a lot of time reading Epictetus's works, the Enchiridion and the Discourses, and reading Seneca's works, which includes at a minimum reading Seneca's letters to Lucilius, but I would also recommend reading Seneca's other treatises as well. I mean, if you want to claim that you're like practicing Stoicism, understanding Stoicism, that ought to be like the most central thing. It's fine to read, other 20th century, 21st century stuff, Massimo's How to Be a Stoic, decent, good literature on it. Don't waste your time on the schmaltzy, not particularly good stuff, but you got to be spending your time with the original thinkers, that's really important. AC, is there any connection between Stoicism and psychology? I think we addressed that. Yes, there's connections between Stoicism and the cognitive approaches like rational emotive behavior therapy and things going on from there. Z, is there a hype about Stoicism in the first quarter of the 21st century? What do you think are the reasons for it? I mean, I don't know what a hype is. There's like a lot of like superficial interest in Stoicism. There's a lot of people using Stoicism wrongly to try to sell you coaching things or stuff like that. And a lot of these people don't actually know much about Stoicism, unfortunately. And then they, if that's your encounter with Stoicism, then you're like, well, these Stoics are kind of jerks. But there's a lot of really, really great work on Stoicism. So you want to kind of stick to the people who are doing good work on it. Zachary, are there any relations between social epistemology and Stoic wisdom, the vices of fake news? I mean, I don't think you have to call it social epistemology. You can call it epistemology applied to social matters. Yeah, fake news if you're buying into fake news, you're foolish and you're misinformed. And if you're calling real news fake news, you're also a vicious person. You're foolish. Sure, there's all sorts of connections to that. Thank you very much. We don't study Stoicism in detail at my faculty. I will dive into Seneca. Well, this actually brings up a great point. Again, this is the person with Cyrillic name. I should learn to be able to read it so I could actually, sound out the letters. Stoicism is not going to be taught as such in a lot of philosophy faculties. And it's one of those things that, like, if you want to study it, nothing holds you back. Not all, but nearly all of the ancient Stoic works are available for you online. We live in a 21st century internet world, right? So if you want to read Seneca's letters, they're there in Wikisource, right? I mean, you can order them and buy them. And I say it's good to own books, right? But you probably have to do that on your own, but there's all these great resources out there, and there's all sorts of groups that you can meet up with. The Stoic Fellowship keeps like a running list and map of all the different meetup groups that you can get involved in. Let's see, Coffee Smug, which modern scholarly work in virtue ethics reflects Stoicism the most? That's a good question. A lot of the stuff that's coming from a either abstract virtue ethics thing where they don't actually know what virtue ethics is because they don't read Aristotle or the Stoics or things like that. They just kind of blather on about how it's different than Kantianism or utilitarianism. Put all that crap aside, right? The Neo-Aristotelian stuff, and Alistair McIntyre would be kind of like front and center in that. They don't really understand Stoicism that well. A. Long wrote a really awesome piece in response to McIntyre's After Virtue about that. That's easily findable on the internet. Someday I'll probably do a video about that piece, or a couple videos, because it's so excellent. Julia Annis, somebody who does know the Stoics, major virtue ethicist. Martha Nussbaum, not into the Stoics, but knows the Stoics, and then we have Stoic virtue ethicists like Christopher Gill, who's writing a whole book on Stoic virtue ethics. I would say if you can get your way through Lawrence Becker's A New Stoicism, that's a virtue ethics. Although that's a tough book. That's a difficult one to read. Coffee Smug video about Stoic meta-ethics would be most awesome. I don't do meta-ethics because I think that meta-ethics doesn't really exist as such. I think every meta-ethics is really a substantive ethics. And I'm in the minority there. Chris Pryor, do you have a favorite passage from any Stoic work which you have memorized and pull out of your daily life when needed? I have no favorites. I do have plenty of, this is a good question. This actually goes to the topic of wisdom. So, I've used this term dogmata a couple times, and a dogma is something that's like a judgment or an opinion. It can also be something that's like a maxim that you say to yourself. So when you're reading Epictetus, and Epictetus over and over again will say, have this ready at hand when you meet this difficulty, or keep this ever in mind. And then he says something. All those little nuggets or quotes, as people like to call them, are the dogmata that we're supposed to use when we run into stuff. So I don't use the pithy quotes like, when I get angry, I say, anger is a temporary madness or stuff like that. But I do apply the teachings to what I'm going through, you know, sometimes successfully, often unsuccessfully, right? And you, the more that you study, this is why it's so important to read the primary text, the more you're stocking your head with this stuff. So instead of, some quote by some second rate, popularizer of Stoicism, you actually have Epictetus or Seneca or Musonius Rufus ready to help you out when you need some help. Ephron, did the Stoics talk about mysticism? They did not. The Stoics are not mystics. So not important at all. That's actually one thing I like about them, because I'm not into mysticism myself. So we're a little bit over time, but I can take a few more questions if anybody wants to ask anything. And then unfortunately, I have to exercise the virtue of fortitude and make myself do the thing I dislike the most about being an academic, and that is grading. I have a lot of grading to catch up on today, and I'm not happy with myself. Somebody asked that question about regret, right? So I regret not having gotten the grading done earlier this week, because on a Sunday afternoon, that's what I'm stuck doing. So Mark says hi and bye. Hey, Mark, good to see you here. Z, is conformity an obstacle to Stoic wisdom? If conformity means something like following, whatever your society is telling you, it's keeping your head down, that's actually a kind of cowardice, most likely, right? From a Stoic position. So yeah, that would be an obstacle to Stoic wisdom. So yeah, that could be a real problem. Commoditat, I don't know. Is that like a German rendering of conformity? AC says, thank you so much for your kind response. You're very welcome. All right. Well, let's call this to an end. Like I mentioned, 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about justice. We'll do a deep dive into it, bringing in the text and then doing, a chat afterwards. And then the next month, we will do courage and temperance. I also do, so pay attention, if you follow me on social media or in YouTube or things like that, I do have a workshop coming up, a free workshop on a new platform that will happen on May 1st about Stoic practices coming from Epictetus's Enchiridion, and that should be pretty cool. So keep your eyes open for that. Otherwise, I'll see all of you, and those of you who are having nighttime, have a good night, have a good evening. Those of you in the morning, have a good morning. Everybody else, have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you later on.